Hello, welcome to this webinar. My name is Eduardo Suarez. I'm the head of comms at the Reuters Institute, and I will be the chair of the event. We are super lucky today. We have a speaker, Nick Newman. As many of you know, he's a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute, and he's also the lead author of the digital news report that we published last month. Nick will speak today about the power of newsletters and podcasts to create news habits and encourage subscription revenue for publishers. And as usual, I always say we will mute every microphone and hide every camera. So please keep both that way so everyone can follow the speaker. You can send any questions at any time by dropping us a message through the chat function that we will actually use for an exercise later on too. I will try to pass as many questions to Nick at the end as possible, and we will finish the seminar in an hour or so, around 3 p.m. UK time. Well, thank you so much for attending the seminar. We hope that this is useful. We encourage you to listen to our DNR podcast series on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. And without further ado, I pass this on to Nick. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be here to talk about one of my favorite subjects. So I will talk about newsletters and podcasts. So that's what it was billed as. Two of the subjects we explore in this year's digital news report. But before that, I really want to talk about the wider story into which email and podcasts fit. So it's really a story we see across the news industry, accelerated by coronavirus, and it's a story from publishers really trying to reach as many people as possible to now focusing much more on engagement, on deep engagement with a smaller number of people who really value something that they do. And that sort of move from reach to engagement implies much deeper levels of loyalty than news brands have historically had in digital formats. And so it requires the building of habits. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. And I personally think that, the key focus for publishers over the next few years is really how to build these kind of formats and approaches that engage people more deeply and with more time than we've been able to do so far. And as I make that case, I will draw on the digital news report data, which, as you know, is based on the largest ongoing survey of news habits. It's survey-based, but I will also draw on a range of other research that we've done over the last few years, which looks particularly the qualitative work, which really helps us understand more about some of these issues of habits than just the data alone. So I'm going to start off by looking at definitions of habit and interactively. So we're going to try a little interactive experiment. I'm going to ask everyone on this call to think about your own digital habits as part of, what do we mean by habits? Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about why it's so hard for news brands to build habit on the internet specifically, compared with, say, in a former era where TV and print were the main ways in which people were relating with news brands. And then I'll offer some frameworks for how to address some of these issues and talk specifically about email and about podcasts and other mechanisms to build habit and loyalty. But first, I want everyone on this call to participate, to reflect just for a minute about your own digital habits. So what is it that you find that you do yourself digitally every day or every week? And I'm talking very much about digital habits. So it doesn't have to be a news thing necessarily, but it's something you do regularly. It's something you do compulsively. It's something you look forward to every day or every week or a particular time or in a particular situation. And once you've spent that minute thinking about a habit that you do or a sequence of things that you do online, you might also wish to think just a little bit about how coronavirus has affected these habits. So basically 1 minute, and then we'll have 30 seconds after that, where if you can use the chat function just to write down your habit and share it with the rest of us, that would be great. And so the 60 seconds starts now. Okay, so that's 60 seconds. So you've now got 30 seconds. If you can just write down some of the things that you do in the chat. Some people have already started doing that, and Eduardo and I will start filtering through them to find some interesting habits or some weird habits. So 30 seconds to do that. Okay, I think, thank you. Everyone has been contributing very well, and it's really one of the advantages of Zoom is you can get a lot of information very, very quickly about digital habits and have a fantastic record of these. So Eduardo, I see you have, I like yours because it's about, it's a weekly one, right? So it's something you do at a particular time. Just tell me a bit about this. Tell us a bit about this.
Yeah, very briefly. It's basically I'm a subscriber of The Economist. I've been a subscriber since the print days, and what I tend to do now is read it after breakfast on Saturdays. I have a bit more time than usual on weekdays, and it's kind of a habit that I've developed. You know, I'm a subscriber. I like to enjoy what I'm paying for, and that's the time of the week that I find more convenient. Yeah. I know that the Economist is trying to be more like a daily pace, but in my case, still weekly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think it's that sense of a time when it's convenient for you to really go in depth on something, and I think other people are kind of talking about that. There's a lot of people just saying, there's no habit. It's just checking. The habit is just checking Instagram or Twitter or whatever it is. What else have you noticed in there, Eduardo? Or you haven't had time?
Yeah. Vera Pineda is saying, for example, many of the things people mentioned. I follow a couple of YouTubers who are fantastic and great at publishing on a certain day and a certain time and promoting their publications ahead of time too. So it's not just, traditional news organizations, also people following people on YouTube or on other digital platforms too. Many people obviously mentioning checking on Twitter and Instagram. Interestingly, Sylvia, our colleague, mentioned that COVID has affected her daily diet, news diet, and she's checking less Twitter and more TV, and that's something that we have also seen at the Digital News Report. But yeah, it's many people mentioning digital platforms, social media. Kristen Kiev is talking about the New York Times Daily newsletter that she opened every day in the afternoons and listen to the daily podcast over my lunch breaks. This is something that I also do, by the way, but usually at night before going to sleep.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
there's a lot here about time of day, isn't there? About doing different things at different times of day. There's a really interesting one here from Borislava Todorova, who, which I think is interesting because she's using different things for different reasons. So checking my social media accounts for sort of updates, and then reading about art on a dedicated arts app. So there's something that is providing real value for her each week, and then checking business news on LinkedIn. So for business, it's something else, and then headlines of newsletters I receive just to keep updated.
Something interesting that I see here coming from Simon Franz from the BBC, but also from Rasmus, people making the distinction between scanning content, like, for example, Simon saying that he scan or skim the BBC, the New York Times, FT every day, but also saving articles to Pocket to read in the evenings, or, for example, enjoying the print edition of the FT weekend. So that kind of distinction between just filling some time or just scanning the headlines and proper reading. So yeah,
no, I think that's really interesting, and just reading some of these, it's quite inspiring actually to see how disciplined people are, particularly at that sort of, how do you brief yourself in the morning? So some people just kind of go to one thing, like an email newsletter. Other people, like Rasmus, are basically, they've got a fixed routine and it's very disciplined, and then they sort of save the longer reads for a time when they're going to do that. But the morning is basically for updating yourself very, very quickly, which I think is really interesting. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, and it's great to see so many examples in there. I'm just going to briefly go back to sharing my screen, and I'm just going to share with you some of my behaviors, odd behaviors, and habits. So actually, some people, I think Natalie in the chat was talking about, basically starting with a lock screen, and every day for me starts with a lock screen. I have a very fixed routine of sort of 4 things I do in when I wake up in the first 15 minutes. So lock screen, look at Twitter is next, then email, and then weather. So I get news there, but there's simply no news app. I have a routine on Tuesdays. Tuesdays is the day that I go to the Reuters Institute in normal times. This, by the way, has been destroyed, this habit, by coronavirus. But it basically starts with Today in Focus, which is the Guardian's daily news podcast, which I love, 25 minutes, and it fits the tube journey that I have, essentially. Then I listen to some music and normally do some work while I'm listening to some music. So I'm using Spotify and trying to learn and progress and learn about some different music. I get out at Oxford train station, and that is the trigger for me to start the Digiday podcast, which is a weekly podcast. It means I never miss one of their weekly podcasts, assuming I'm going to Oxford. And there's like a 20-minute walk from the station to the Institute. Perfect for the Digiday podcast. On the way back, I'm normally really tired after a day at the Institute, so I will do my Premier League. Tuesday's a good day to think about the Premier League, updating my fantasy football team, and then I finish with whatever it says there. I can't see. It finishes with another podcast. Yeah, it finishes another podcast with something called The Leader, which is, again, it's like timed for my return journey. It's about sort of 15 minutes evening podcast. And then the other thing I've noticed, which is particularly true in coronavirus, so I'm listening to fewer podcasts because of coronavirus, and everything is about email now. I don't really visit news websites or apps. Everything is sort of filtered through some curation of some kind. So email, Nuzzle, which is an aggregator, The Spoon, which is a really good sort of concise email takes you about 2 to 3 minutes. It's supported by donations, actually. Redbox is a political email, fantastic political email, which is part of the subscription. The Athletic, which comes 2 or 3 times a week, and that's again an email for my passion, which is about football. And then again, what's that last one? Oh, Neiman Lab. That drops later in the day, so that's about my work. There's other things in there as well, but it's just this is how I'm living my life now in terms of digital habits. I'm not sure how these habits have happened, but that's kind of where we are. Okay, what do we find about habit in general? So I think, as we've seen in this chat, there's just a huge range of habits. In the old days, the habits were sitting down in front of the television, or, your morning commute, or with a coffee over, reading newspaper over coffee or something. Now there are so many different habits and so many different combinations of habits, as illustrated by the chat. And, I think that's really interesting. Many have nothing to do with news. So a lot of the habits, in fact, because this is a news crowd, a lot of people were talking about news, but you were also talking about communication apps like Twitter or Slack. And news is kind of part of that, but it's not the main point. So it's kind of incidental to the habit you have is for the app and for Twitter and for everything that goes with it. And news is part of that experience, but it is not the complete experience. As we've heard, often it's related to particular news requirements or particular times of day. And it's often triggered by something. So in my case, coming out of Oxford train station, that is my mental memory to get out my app and to start the Digiday podcast, for example. And in those environments, and lots of people mentioned communication apps, our brands are often not at the center of it. So the relationship is with Twitter and not necessarily with, The Guardian or BBC News or El País or whatever it is. I think the other thing is the whole question. Has been a lot of work done on habit. So a lot of academic research, a lot of books about how habits are formed in the first place, but also how you can break habits, how habits are broken. So notably, Charles Duhigg wrote a very good book, which I recommend, called The Power of Habit, which talks about this habit loop with the idea of the cue. And so that's me walking out of the station in Oxford. You have the routine, and then you have the reward of something that is satisfying. And as you go around that loop 2 or 3 times, then essentially it becomes automatic. It becomes an automatic craving. So the question is, how can you sort of get that loop working so that it doesn't need to work anymore, because it becomes just part of what you do all the time. And a lot of Silicon Valley companies have taken these ideas and tried very successfully to build them into the software. So if you look on your mobile phone, all those little red alerts and numbers are all sort of ways to get you, to cue you into what they hope will become a routine. So what does all this mean for news specifically? And I think one of the things that digital has really done is entrench some very is disrupt some very entrenched habits. So we've already talked about sort of the commute, and this is a picture taken a few years ago of a very entrenched habit. A lot of people reading a newspaper, and there was a time for news. There was a time, and there was a product that was designed, specifically for that updating process at the beginning of the day or the end of the day. And a lot of them were newspapers. And then what we've had with digital, and particularly the arrival of the smartphone, is changed all that. And suddenly there is no dedicated time for news. There is this amazing device that is connected or often connected. And within it, you have all these other opportunities to do things, often much more enticing than news, much less frightening than news. So entertainment and communication, all of these things now are available at the touch of a button. And news is no longer, news has to compete in that environment with entertainment and communications. And that means that it needs to work a lot harder. Essentially, it needs to work a lot harder. So this is particularly the case with the younger generation. And last year, we did a study where we tracked the time people spent on their mobile phones and the apps they use. So it was a qualitative study, and it involved 20 people. They were all under 35. And we tracked their smartphone use over 10 days. And we also then interviewed them about some of the things they've done and got them to reflect on those things. And what this graphic really does is it just orders the apps in terms of the amount of time people spent across the 20 people. And so Instagram sitting at the top there, 20 people, the 20 suggests that 20 people had the app. So everybody basically had the app. And the most time out of all of the apps was spent with Instagram. You can see also other communications app, Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Twitter, YouTube. So in total, these young people were spending 70 to 80% of their time with communications apps. And as we found elsewhere, I mean, I just look, there are a few other things in there in terms of, content and destinations for content. So you can see podcasts there are quite significant. You can see Spotify, you can see Netflix. So people are consuming and spending time with those applications, but interestingly, not as much as the communication apps. And where's the news? So we did find, fortunately, we found news apps there, but none of them in the top 25. And the ones that were often installed by default, i.e. Apple News for Apple users. And in total, the amount of time, if looking at individuals, was around 1% was spent with news, or was spent with these apps at least. So if you're not really spending much time, it's very hard to maintain relationships. And in many cases, there is no real direct relationship. So everything, for people who don't have those apps, is just mediated through these, for young people in particular, through the smartphone, through these alternative apps. And this is really, the big challenge. And we did find this problem more widely when we did tracking studies, not just with young people, but with the whole population. This is some data from a project we did in 2017. And you can see that, some brands do have more of a direct connection. So, some apps are very popular in some countries. These are all UK brands. There is one brand here that found 34 minutes per person per month, and each person read about 31 stories a month. So people are spending time with that brand. They're spending time with them on the mobile phone. They trust them. There is a possibility of building, real direct connections. But if you look at the other brands, and pretty much all the other brands we looked at, or most of the other brands we looked at, most of the people were accessing through somebody else's experience, i.e. through somebody else's app or Twitter or whatever. So the direct traffic was much lower. The amount of time per month, 5 minutes for brand B, 3 minutes for brand C, 5 stories a month. And that's simply not enough, as I say, to develop the habit you need and the engagement you need that is going to help fund sustainable journalism going forwards, I would argue. And I think, the other thing we found from this research is that habit ultimately comes from that reward delivered consistently over time. So delivering something valuable and trustworthy and reliable time and time again is the thing that builds trust, is the thing that builds people confidence to come back. Okay, so what does good look like, and what should we be aiming for? And this is an example going back to the tracking study we did with young people, tracking the 20 young people. This is just looking at one person's experience, a male user in their 20s. And what you can see here is a habit. You can see a very specific habit linked to a commuting routine. This young 20-year-old is essentially using the Daily Mail, and the little blue triangles essentially show the days that, how much time they used the app for in the morning. You can see quite a compressed morning routine. So basically they're going to work at pretty much exactly the same time. And then you can see the evening commute is a little bit more varied. So it depends what they're doing, presumably about what time they're going home. And this person is spending between 7 and 40 minutes with the Daily Mail app. So it is possible to build time and to build habit in digital. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that we talked to a number of these users, and the habit often, or the brand they are most associated with, actually comes from that relationship. In this case, a relationship in the house already. So many of them grew up with a brand that has become their sort of go-to anchor brand. If they were going to go directly, this person goes to the Mail because it was the one they get at home, the one they felt familiar with. So again, you can see the kind of importance of relationships and building relationships when you're sort of trying to think about building sustainable journalism going forward. What's interesting, though, was that this person isn't just, doesn't just have habits that is linked to one brand. I mean, it's not surprising. A young person is essentially getting news in lots of different ways. So they combine a direct relationship with the mail with Twitter and Instagram. And this basically shows how Twitter and Instagram is sort of filling in the gaps, essentially. So right the way through the day, they are accessing a range of news brands. Interestingly, in this case, not the Mail, it's BBC News, Sky, The Guardian, for different reasons. And they are just sort of snacking and keeping up with what's going on. This person, in fact, says they get most of their news via Twitter, for example. Here's another example, which I think is particularly interesting. So again, it's another male in their 20s, this time in the US, somebody actually who works in finance and has a very interesting routine in the morning, which includes a lot of things, including email about the markets, because they work in finance. But they also use an app that has been specifically designed to provide a very concise update, digital update in the morning for Economist subscribers. And this is called the Espresso app, and it's a very concise, you spend 10 minutes with it. So on average, this person is not spending much time with it, but you can see how it's a routine. It's something that they value and probably gets triggered as they go onto the subway or whatever to get to work. And you can see how it's aimed at the morning. This app is specifically aimed at a morning use case, not an afternoon use case. So it's different from the one we saw before. And again, the importance of the relationship and the brand. So it's not just the content, it is the connection with the brand. So the brand aligns most of the time anyway with the way I view the world. So it's this sort of combination between the emotional connection, the relationship, if you like, and the reward of delivering something valuable, which helps to build the habit. Interesting also that they do that in combination with print. This person does it in combination with print. So I think the point is that here it's now individual consumers who are in control, who are increasingly putting together their own portfolio of media and scheduling these sort of packages of value, if you like, for themselves to fit their own lifestyles. And the example I gave of my Tuesday, I have shaped my Tuesday habits to fit the points in the day when I've got time to really engage with different media content. In this case, with audio. So we're kind of moving away from the idea that news brands should provide a little bit of everything in one brand. Now it's not the publishers who are the aggregators; it's the individuals in many cases who are the aggregators. And the thing that allows them to do it is to create, if publishers can create these items of deep value, which they spend time with, you can still get the best of both worlds. You can get a publisher direct relationship, and that user can be in control. And I think that's kind of the sort of big change that we're making here. Okay, so in this new fragmented world where consumers are more in charge, how can we build habit where a news brand actually plays a critical role? And again, going back to the qualitative work we did last year, the key insight here for me was around scheduling news around those moments and around the mindsets that accompany the moments. So Eduardo at the beginning was talking about his Saturday morning, for example. That is what we call here a dedicated moment. So you're really sitting down to enjoy your news and your current affairs. It suits the weekends, for example. Your mindset is more introspective. It's about deepening and developing understanding, and you have made time for that. And what was interesting was we found young people who wanted to do that too. And I think there are, this is a sort of core need that we can develop more products for than just a print product for extension. And then this is the second one is about being updated. So we've talked about quite a lot about this. This is really about efficiency. Going back to Rasmus's very efficient way of accessing as much news as possible first thing in the morning in a very defined period of time. He's self-scheduling a lot of that, but other people prefer it in a package. So they prefer the New York Times Daily Update email, or the Today in Focus from The Guardian. And some of this is obviously on a commute. And it's not so much about relaxation, it's often about how can I get as much information in the time that I've got. So it's a very different mindset. Thirdly, time filler. So we've all had a moment where, there's nothing much going on and you've got a little bit of a break and you just want something to read or something to talk about or something to laugh at. And this is really where a lot of sort of visual storytelling works really well. Memes are really popular in this regard. So you're not in the mood for something serious at this point. This is a time filler. It's something short. It's something to stimulate your interest. And then finally, we found these sort of intercepted moments. So you're not really interested in news, but something happens that is really important and you're prepared to be interrupted because it's something that really matters to you. And in this sense, that the mind, the news finds you in this sense. So then I think, what publishers are starting to do is not think about the all-purpose website, but think about the range of formats and approaches that can engage people in these moments on their terms. So it may be the magazine, maybe the supplement, it may be the news app or the edition. This is where you're getting your most loyal users, and you have a relationship where they're prepared to really sit down with you. Then you have a range of products in the updated category. We've talked about them, daily news podcasts. You have off-platform formats, then like posts and stories and memes. And then you have alerts where you can intercept people and bring people up the journey into your brand. So what we're really trying to do here is to take people on a journey. And I think publishers are being much more strategic about this now. So it sort of starts with awareness, and this is often where social media plays a role. So it's really about making people aware of your brand, showcasing some of your wares, if you like. And then the triggers, which may be sort of alerts or whatever. You're starting a relationship. Maybe you're using social media to get an email address, to get people to subscribe to an email, or maybe to sample a podcast. And then you're providing the value in the updated products. And from these, so people are getting the value out of email, they're getting value out of podcasts, and then they're much more open to upsell to premium content, maybe a subscription even. And this is obviously what publishers like the New York Times are doing. They're using those as a way of bringing people into a relationship where they can showcase everything that they've got. So, and that's hopefully where you get to that point of relationship and habit and loyalty. So there are many other products you can think of that you could layer onto that map, but from this year's digital news report, I'm going to talk a little bit just finally about what we know about how this is working for two of the products that publishers are focusing on most in this regard. So that is email and podcasts. So email first. Email's obviously been around a long time, but for the reasons I've mentioned, it's taking on a much bigger role in the engagement processes as publishers place more value on engagement and more value on that relationship building. So in terms of numbers, actually only a minority are getting newsletters. It's something like 16% across 40 countries, but it's a really interesting group for publishers. So it's richer, they're better educated, they're a bit older, they're more interested in news, they're definitely more likely to pay for news. Email is used more, as you can see here, in some countries than others. So for example, in the US, 21% say that they're using email regularly. Around half of them say it's their main source of news. So, it is the sort of the starting point. It is the way, the filter through which they access all kinds of news and information. But compare that with the UK, just 9% saying that they're using email. So that's partly because publishers have placed less value on it. And I think, that's beginning to change. So I would expect that to change over the next few years. In terms of type, so you have two types of email newsletters. So firstly, you have scheduled ones. Essentially, they are often editorially curated. They arrive at the same time every day or every week. And then you have, in the blue, you have alerts, essentially. So many people set up alerts based on their name or a subject they're particularly interested in, or they just sign up to breaking news events. So they arrive irregularly. And the scheduled ones are the ones that are used most. They have slightly different purposes, clearly. What we find is that most people are subscribing, most email users are subscribing to one of these daily email alerts. So that may be a general one, or it may be one specifically around politics. And then around half are also have breaking news emails. And some of these are really just a whole load of links where you get a really good summary of what's going on. Some of them are actually just sort of, they're designed to be read in their entirety, and you don't necessarily need to go anywhere else. So they're both content and showcases and front pages into a range of different content. And there are different ways of looking at this. On average, people in the US tend to get more emails than in other countries, around 4. You can see the pattern is very different here from the UK. So there are fewer people subscribe to fewer emails on the whole in the UK, so maybe 1 or 2. The median in the US is around 4. And surprisingly, in all of the countries, almost half say they read most of their news emails each day. Maybe they're lying. I definitely don't read all of the news emails, but I read some of them and get a lot of value out of them. On the publisher side, for the reasons that I said earlier, they're really putting a lot more effort into their email newsletters and into their strategies. And I'm sure you've sort of seen this and noticed this yourself. So somewhere around 60 to 70 email newsletters now for the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the priority is really going up. So you can see here, these are just some of the ones in terms of the regular update. So they've got updates for different parts of the world. They've got updates aimed at the US, this sort of big flagship product called The Morning, which now has a curated host. So David Leonhardt, a really senior journalist in the New York Times, is now responsible for sort of anchoring the news of the day for around 17 million subscribers at the New York Times to that email alone. So it's, not the biggest source of their journalism, but it's a really major way now in which people are accessing New York Times content, for example. And in terms of the strategic purpose, emails, I kind of alluded to this already, they have a sort of dual purpose. So it's partly sampling, it's partly trying to find new subscribers or new people to your brand that you can start a relationship with. And because most of them tend to be free, it's allowing you essentially to sample that content for free. And then the other thing it's trying to do here is getting existing users to come more often. So it's trying to increase the frequency. And the reason for that is to deepen the engagement, to reduce the risk that they will go somewhere else. And so over time, you're kind of building that habit loop all the time through increasing frequency by reminding people every day at the same time that you have something of value for them. And so emails are really good at doing both of those things. And publishers have got much better at using, thinking about the strategies associated with those. So I mentioned that most of them are free, but we're seeing increasingly this content being so valuable to consumers, the curation, the sense of saving time, whatever it is, that that people can actually put it into the main bundle. So the Times of London, for example, used to have Red Box, which is its political podcast email, outside the paywall, so a sampling strategy, and now it's moved it within the paywall. So it's something of real value that only subscribers have, and it's part of a package of subscription content around political news and high quality political news. What I love about this email is that it's so personality driven. So one of the problems with digital, and one of the reasons why it's so hard to build habit, is because it's so cold and clinical, and you don't really engage with it in the way that you can with audio or with television or even with print. But something like Matt Chorley, who's also doing stand-up comedy, and it's a really, really fun email and a serious email at the same time, but it has real personality. And it's one of the things I really like about it, and I think people really value. And then finally on email, this really just shows the relationship between subscription and email. So subscribers to news websites, so people who pay, are significantly more likely to use news emails than non-subscribers. It's not particularly surprising, because the publishers are trying to push that, of course, in every country we look at. But in terms of the difference, you can see that US and Belgian publishers have done a particularly good job in getting, 4 in 10 of their subscribers to take up email. Much lower levels, I'm surprised to see in Nordic countries, which we traditionally think are really good at this sort of stuff. So then finally moving on to podcasts. So this is another area where publishers have been really investing, again, for the same reasons, because they're really good at sort of attracting new people to start that relationship building, but also for building habit. We find podcasts are growing year on year. We've been tracking this for a few years, and every year, 1-2% increases in most countries. Across a basket of countries, 31% now say they're using podcasts monthly. News is about half of that. And the daily news category, which has only really been around for 2-3 years, is really interesting. It's aimed at that sort of update me. Phil, give me the world, give me a story in the half an hour I've got in my commute. And so it's really hitting that very specific user need. And because audio also is great at building relationships, again, that idea of the host, the editorial curation, it's really bringing a lot of that personality too. And during coronavirus, we have seen those habits disrupted, obviously, because, so many people listen to podcasts on the commute. So that curve has flattened. We've seen the curve flatten. But we've also seen a lot of innovation around formats. So as you can see here, a lot of daily coronavirus podcasts instead. And people really like these because of the depth that they provide. So people are typically engaging for 20-25 minutes a day, often for 2 to 3 episodes a week. So that's a much deeper type of engagement. And in this year, we asked, 50% of the people who use podcasts say that they give a deeper understanding of issues than other kinds of media. And that's partly because of the amount of time that you're spending with those. Reminder that the age profile is really interesting. So I talked about email being older. Podcasts are really good for attracting younger audiences. In the UK, half of all podcasts consumed by under 35s. Under 35s make up about 1/3 of the population, so that's disproportionately higher. The radio profile is obviously the other way around, so much older people. We can also look at the age profile for different types of podcasts. And again, if you look at the top left, news and current affairs, so that's kind of the daily news podcast and other news podcasts. Again, really hitting the spot with 25 to 34. So, the young millennials, essentially. 18 to 24 is also interested in news and current affairs, though a little bit less. They're more interested in lifestyle and true crime a little bit. And finally, it's just worth bearing in mind that for most publishers, audio is not a sort of holy grail. It also has a whole load of platforms that you have to deal with. So the whole discovery process, it's not completely direct, but I think there's something about the amount of time that even if you're discovering those things through the platforms, you have enough time to really build that relationship wherever people find these. This is just some data that we did for the first time this year, where we're asking people what platforms people use for accessing podcasts. And it's interesting, it used to be just Apple, but we're increasingly seeing Spotify as either the number 1 or number 2 in many markets. And I think that is really going to help take podcasts to a wider demographic and very much to that younger demographic as well, increase the reach within that younger demographic. So just to recap, and then really looking forward to your questions. Sorry, I've gone on. So the internet essentially has fragmented attention and disrupted a lot of habits around news, particularly those really strong habits we had around print and television. And we need to work out how to put some of those things back. And there is no easy fix. You can't sort of do it overnight. And you can't go straight to habit. You have to build that trusted relationship first. You have to demonstrate the value before you can get to the habit. Especially, and this is going to be especially difficult for brands that really focused much more in the past on satisfying advertisers rather than satisfying readers. So as publishers focus much more on readers, that's about building the trust and then building the habit. We need to think about different kinds of audiences and the moments that they are open to engaging with our brands in different ways. And then build that journey. So you're starting with the awareness, then into more regular usage, and then into dedicated habits. So that's the kind of the journey that you want to take people on, and the method you do it is I think increasingly it's going to be around these packages of value. So curated editorial products that really distinguish what it is journalists do from the massive information on the internet, like email, like podcasts, and can build habit, but it can also really bring personality to digital, which is often lacked. So thank you very much. Hopefully that has stimulated a few questions, which I look forward to, Eduardo.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a fascinating presentation. As I said before, I encourage everyone to send their questions through the chat function. It's Nick is going to be with us for 10, 15 minutes more, so I'm sure that he will answer them. I'm going to start myself, Nick, and I have a question regarding podcasting. The Daily from the New York Times is at the top of the charts, at Spotify and other apps. Why do you think is that? Why do you think is that a daily newspaper has been the most successful, in terms of creating a daily podcast, and not, a TV station, a radio station that had the capabilities and the know-how to do this?
I think it's the sort of innovator's dilemma. It's essentially that they can take risks in a way that the broadcasters had to broadly protect their existing linear, and so this was an opportunity for newspapers to do what broadcasters did to them, back in the day, and do something different, break the rules because they had nothing to lose, and so they created a format. I mean, to some extent, it was drawn on a lot of great narrative techniques that were actually pioneered by NPR, but they kind of also added a personality and a difference, and they sold it to a different audience. So I think, and it's really been interesting to see how that format has been copied all over the world now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have a couple of questions. The first one is about email from Natalie Malinaric, and she's asking, you mentioned that newsletters skew older. Have you come across any news organizations which have succeeded with younger audiences, or countries in which younger audiences may consume email newsletters?
That's a great question, Natalie. I can't immediately think of I'm sure there are lots of examples, and I think most publications that are focusing on younger audiences are looking at a multi-channel strategy, including email, but they would tend to focus more on social media because that's where the sort of demographics are. So it's not that young people don't use email, but they're using it a lot less. It's not the natural way to engage people. So I think it's more what would be an alternative? Where are people spending their time? And I think it goes back to that question of, when we were looking at under 35s and where they spend their time, they weren't spending much time in email. So it's unlikely that that's going to be the best place to engage them.
If I can point this out, I mean, there's a successful example, not with email, but with Telegram. Telegram is a messaging app, and El Diario in Spain has a very successful Telegram channel. They send like 2 or 3 updates every day, and the open rate is like 60% or something like that, with 30,000 followers. So it's not exactly an email, but it's something very similar to what Nate has described before. We have
just to add to that. I mean, Natalie is from the BBC, and I think you've been really good at taking the content of that daily email and saying it's not just an email, right? What it is it's meeting that need of an update, and we're going to put it on the front page of the website. We can put it in lots of different places, and places like Africa, for example, you see emails basically being delivered by WhatsApp as PDFs. So not necessarily email itself, but the idea of that sort of compressed set of links, or just give me the news where I don't need to click off somewhere, that can really engage young people if you're using the right channel.
Okay, a question from our friend Marcela Kunova, and she's asking, have you noticed any factors that make readers engage with one podcast app over another? In many cases, the same shows are available elsewhere. We've noticed, right, Nick, that Spotify is rising right now. Any clues about that?
Again, a lot of this goes back to what people feel what people are using every day. If people are using Spotify, then there is an age profile that goes with Spotify. And so the list of the ones that are most popular in Spotify will be a little bit different from, say, Apple Podcasts or people who are listening from BBC Sounds. In fact, I looked at the demographics in our survey for BBC Sounds. For Spotify, it's really, really young. And for BBC Sounds, people listening to the same podcast, it's much older. So it's just different people preferring to use different apps because they're things that they're used to or they're using for other reasons. And so I think, this is going to be a mixed and very complicated ecosystem, actually. I think it's going to become increasingly complicated. It's really interesting to see the platforms not just wanting to be distributors in this environment, starting to create content as well. I think yesterday Apple announced they were going to launch a daily news podcast of their own. They announced that they're doing, premium audio read stuff as well. So audio is hotting up in many, many different ways, and the platforms won't be just like Facebook, not creating content. In this space, I think that you're going to see the platforms. You have already seen the platforms creating content.
Two questions now from Samiha Abubakar, very interesting ones, actually. First one, for news organizations, do you see any attempts to convert podcast and newsletter customers into consumers of their other editorial products? So that would be one. And the second one is, how do you consistently ensure an interactive element with audiences? And she's speaking about, for example, podcasts creating Facebook groups to discuss, some of the things that they are discussing on the podcast.
Yeah, really good questions. So the which I've forgotten already. What was the first one?
Sure, no worries. Yeah. The first one is about news. News publishers like trying to convert their podcast listeners and newsletter customers into consumers of other editorial products.
So I mean that's definitely happening, and that's part of the aim. So the part of particularly for subscription publishers, they are looking to get the next generation of subscribers, and they've got to a stage where things have flattened out a little bit, and they want to get to that next group of people. And so really starting that relationship, they recognize it's going to be a long haul. So within the daily or whatever, you're getting messages for special offers for subscriptions. The Economist does this as well, but I think it's not just subscription. As I say, this is a journey. So in many cases, it's actually what people are trying to do is to get people to subscribe to one newsletter and then subscribe to another newsletter, because the data tells them that if they subscribe to 2 or 3, that they're going to be even more loyal. So actually, this is often a trade-off about what it is you promote within a podcast or an email newsletter, because you have limited space. Are you going to promote for this particular person? Are you going to promote another thing to increase them on the journey? Or are you going to push straight for subscription or for money or for whatever it happens to be? But I think, yes, we're going to see a lot more of that. And then the other question you asked is the sort of relationship between podcasts and other things. And I think this is a really interesting area. You're seeing a lot of podcasts which are developing this amazing relationship with a host. And then how do you take that brand and extend that brand into other things? So events is the obvious example. But actually, I mentioned Matt Chorley. He did a whole stand-up comedy tour. There's a Redbox political podcast that came off the back of the Newsmail e-letter. So this is like a 360, approach where you're creating a brand within a brand and you're building up a really, really loyal audience for that content.
A question from John Sutcliffe. German broadcasters are experimenting with TikTok to reach younger audiences with news content. Should UK broadcasters do something similar? And also, I mean, is this a way to create habit in younger audiences?
The answer is it's kind of a bit too early to tell, isn't it? I mean, it's very, very recent that TikTok was really something that people talked about in the news, and this has really happened because of George Floyd and coronavirus and Korean doctors washing their hands on TikTok. And we've seen some amazing examples of sort of engagement, but it's a bit more like sort of Instagram engagement of sort of it's not really going into depth with things, but it's often funny, it's often stimulating content. And, we've kind of seen some of this before with Vine and other short form. So, it's not the answer, but it's part of that awareness journey. And, when brands think about should they be doing it or not, the tone is obviously critical. The Washington Post did some great examples. I'm not quite sure how ARD and German broadcasters are going down in TikTok, but there is a danger of not getting the tone right and actually doing more damage. So this is going to be a voyage of discovery and experimentation, I would say. And of course, it's really just 18 to 24s at the moment is what we find in our data.
Tomás Warna makes almost an existential question. I mean, why do people choose to listen to your news podcast instead of scrolling Twitter and see what's going on? What do you think makes people actually spend like 20 minutes every morning with a daily podcast?
It's just the depth of engagement and the personality, I think. In many ways, this is just, what audio has always been good at. Is creating that relationship that it's an individual talking to you directly, and that is completely different experience from sort of reading a whole load of cold links in email newsletter. And generally, what emails newsletters do is it gives you the chance to get a whole load of information in a short period of time. What some of these daily news podcasts doing is really exploding all that and looking at one issue in depth. And I feel at the end of listening to daily news podcasts, I'm a big fan that I've really, really learned something. And when we did the research into this last year, the sort of qualitative research, it was that sense, particularly with 18 to 24s, the under 35s, it was about that sense of learning and progression that you really, really learned because you've got your headphones on. It's a really intimate environment. You're really taking it in a way that often you don't when you've got the distractions of everything else that's going on your screen.
Final question from Paolo Magnani. How are publishers using newsletters as an advertising channel? I mean, most of them have ads, right? And yeah. Do you have any examples of that or interesting examples you can mention?
I think, to me, the ad side is a bit of icing on the cake. A lot of this is about, so you have to think about the business model. So some business models are absolutely about sponsorship. And so, the ad or the association is the core way in which they're funded. I'm thinking of Politico and other things. For others, it's a completely different role. It's essentially much more about, just engaging people. So they don't want to put a whole load of ads in the way. So the New York Times and others, you won't see very many ads within that. And in many cases, it might be within house ads. And something like The Spoon, which I mentioned, which I use, which is just a very compressed, pared down, really simple thing. It's just got one message at the bottom saying, give us some money if you like it. And so I think, it will be different for different publishers, the extent to which but primarily this is not about ads.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you. I hope that everyone has enjoyed so much as I did. And finally, as I always say, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. We will send you a copy of Nick's presentation and also the video, the link to the video of this webinar, so you can share it and watch it later. We want to remind you that we have another webinar coming up next week. In this case, with Anne Schultz. She will speak about local journalism, local news, local and regional news, about the section that she has written for the Digital News Report. So hopefully you will be with us. It will be on Thursday, next Thursday at 2 p.m. UK time. So we want you to be with us next week too. And finally, as I always say, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, so we encourage you to follow the advice of the authorities, wash your hands frequently, and wear a face mask if possible in public spaces. Thank you so much. Thank you to Nick for being with us, and well, see you next week, hopefully. Bye.
Bye.